The morning we buried my wife, my daughter Nettie stopped talking, and for 11 months I told myself a lie I half believed, that she'd start again on her own, the way a stream breaks loose come spring. She didn't. She went through the days like a small ghost in a calico dress, 6 years old and silent as a stone in the creek bed, and every night I'd sit on the edge of her bed and wait for a word that never came. I'd made Adeline a promise as she lay dying. I'd held her hand, thin as a bird's wing by then, and I'd sworn I would keep our children's hearts open to the world. Keep them warm, she'd said. Don't let the cold get in, hold. And I'd said yes, of course, yes, and meant it down to the bone. I broke that promise a little more every day, and I knew it. Because I'd let the cold get into me first. I'd ridden the wishbone alone through a grief so big I couldn't see around it, and I'd let the house go quiet to match my daughter, and I'd let my boy Jesse, 11 years old and madder than a roped wolf at a world that took his mother, turn hard as a green hickory branch. I told myself I was holding things together. The truth was I was holding nothing. I was a man standing in the wreck of his own home, telling the dead I was doing fine. That was how things stood the late spring afternoon. Tamsin Hale rode up my road with 8 head of horses behind her, and didn't so much as slow down to feel sorry for any of us. I'd written to a man down in Sumner about a gentler. I had a blue roan stud, 4 years old, that had killed one man's collarbone and broken another's hand, and that I could not sell and would not shoot, because Adeline had loved that ugly devil from the day he was foaled, and I couldn't bring myself to put a bullet in one more thing she'd loved. The man in Sumner had written back that there was a woman came through that country every year about now, drifting her own horses up to the high grass, and that she could put a hand on anything with hooves. He'd underlined the word woman like he was warning me. I'd expected, I don't rightly know what I'd expected, somebody to fuss over, somebody I'd have to mind. What rode into my yard was a lean, weathered woman near my own age in a man's canvas coat, and a flat-brimmed hat gone gray with dust, sitting her horse like she'd grown out of the saddle. She had a face the sun had been at for years and pale eyes that took in the whole place at a glance, the sagging gait, the boy glaring from the barn, the little girl half hidden behind the rain barrel, and didn't pity 1 inch of it. "You'd be Merrick," she said, "not a question." "I would." Tamsin Hale. She swung down easy, looped a lead, and looked past me at the corral where the roan was already pinning his ears and showing the whites of his eyes. "That him?" "That's him. He's hurt 2 men. He scared 2 men. She walked to the rail slow and the stud charged it, and she didn't flinch, didn't coo at him, didn't do a single soft thing. She just stood and let him blow and rear and crash off the far side, and she watched, and after a while she said, "He'll do." Like the horse had passed a test, not her. I told her the terms. A month's work, a fair wage, the use of the line shack down by the creek so she'd have her own roof. She listened with her head tipped, and then she said the only thing that afternoon that landed anywhere near my heart. "Your young ones," she said, nodding toward the barrel, toward the barn. "I won't be mothering them. I came for the horse. Tell them so they don't expect it." I should have bristled. Any other day I might have. But there was something in the plain way she said it, no cruelty, just a fence post set square, that made my throat go tight, because it was the first honest thing a grown person had said in my yard in near a year. Everybody else who'd come up that road had come with their faces arranged into pity, with casseroles and careful voices, asking after the children in tones you'd use on the sick. And the children had hated it. I'd watched them hate it. Nettie went smaller, Jesse went harder, every time some good woman from Sumner knelt down and said how brave they were being. Tamsin Hale didn't kneel down to anybody. "All right," I said, "I'll tell them." I didn't have to. Nettie had heard. She'd come out from behind the rain barrel without my noticing, the way she did everything now, silent, sideways, like she was afraid of the noise her own feet might make, and she stood there in the spring mud watching that gray-eyed woman the way she hadn't watched anything in 11 months, with her whole face. And Tamsin, swinging back up to take her string down to the shack, looked down at my daughter once, just once, and gave her a short nod. the kind you'd give a man. Then she rode off without another word. Nettie watched her all the way down to the creek. It was nothing. I knew it was nothing. But I'd stopped getting even nothings from my girl, and I stood there in the yard a long time after, with the cold spring wind coming down off the Sabre Hills, feeling something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't know its name. It was hope, and I was half afraid of it, because the last time I'd hoped I'd been holding Adeline's hand, and the doctor had been lying to us both. I want to tell it true, so I'll say it plain. Tamsin Hale did not save my children, not the way the church ladies would tell it later, all soft-edged and tidy. She didn't gather them up or sweeten them or talk them back to life. She'd told me flat she wouldn't, and she didn't. What she did was work where they could see her. Those first weeks she was down at the corral by gray light and gone past dark, and she worked that killer roan with a patience that wasn't soft at all, it was iron, just slow iron. She never struck him. She never raised her voice. She'd put a rope on him and let him fight it, and the second he gave 1 inch she gave the inch back. And she did that 10,000 times, and the horse that had broken 2 men's bones started, by the end of the first week, to follow that gray-eyed woman around the pen with his big, ugly head low like a dog. Jesse pretended he wasn't watching. He watched. He'd hang on the far rail with his hat down and his arms crossed, working hard at looking sullen, and I'd see his eyes follow every move she made. My boy had loved horses since before he could walk, the way his mother had. It was the one thing that had survived in him whole. And here was this woman doing the thing he loved better than he'd ever seen it done, and not making a fuss about him, and it ate at him like a splinter. About the 10th day, he couldn't stand it anymore. "That's wrong how you're holding that line," he said, loud, spoiling for it. "My pa does it different." I was up at the barn and I started down, my neck hot, ready to take my boy by the collar. Tamsin didn't even look around. "Your pa's likely right for your pa's hands," she said, working all the while. "Come show me then." It stopped him cold. He'd expected anger or worse, that soft, pitying voice. He hadn't expected to be handed the rope. He stood there a second with his mouth working, and then, because he was 11 and proud and dying too, he climbed the rail and dropped into that pen with the horse that had broken a man's hand, and I near called out, and Tamsin lifted 2 fingers off the line, just barely, a small flat gesture that said to me clear as a shout, "Leave it." So I left it. God help me. I leaned on the rail and I left my boy in a pen with a killer horse and a stranger, and I have never in my life trusted anything the way I trusted the back of that woman's neck in that minute. She handed Jesse the line. She stood at his shoulder, not touching him, and she said low things I couldn't hear, and my boy's hands were shaking, and the roan rolled his eye at him and then dropped his head. Just dropped it and blew and stood. And Jesse held that line connected to 1,500 pounds of gentle down trouble, and something came up in my son's face that I hadn't seen since the funeral. Something lit. "There," Tamsin said, plain as bread. "Your hands are fine. You were just scared of him, that's sense, not weakness. He's scared of you too." She took the line back. "Same time tomorrow, you want to learn the rest." Jesse came over the rail and walked past me toward the house with his ears red, and his jaw set hard against the grin trying to break it open. And he didn't say a word to me. But that night at supper, he ate like a boy who'd done a day's work he was proud of, and I caught him looking down toward the line shack twice through the window. It was the first crack. I didn't dare name it, but I saw it. Nettie's crack came slower, and it like to broke my heart wide open when it came. My girl had taken to slipping down to the creek of an afternoon to watch the horsework from the brush, thinking nobody saw. I saw. I'd find her crouched in the willows with her knees to her chin, that small, silent shape, watching Tamsin the way you'd watch weather. And Tamsin saw her too, I knew she did. That woman missed nothing, but she never once called out to her, never coaxed, never did the thing every soul in Sumner had done, which was try to pull words out of my daughter like pulling a stuck nail. She just let her be, she let her watch. And then one afternoon in early summer, Tamsin took a Greenbroke filly off her string, a sweet-eyed little sorrel, and she walked it on a lead right up to the edge of the willows where Nettie was hidden, and she stopped, and she didn't look at the brush at all. She looked at the filly, and she said to the horse in that flat, plain voice, "She's gentle. She likes it when you breathe slow at her. She won't bite a soul stands quiet." And then she dropped the lead, and she walked off to the corral, and left that gentle filly standing there cropping grass 3 feet from my hidden daughter. I was up at the woodpile, frozen with the axe in my hands. It took Nettie the better part of an hour. The sun came around. I split no wood, and bit by bit my girl came out of the willows, an inch at a time, and put her small hand flat on that filly's neck, and stood there breathing slow at a horse the way a gray-eyed stranger had told her to. And the filly leaned into her. And my daughter, my silent daughter who hadn't touched another living thing on purpose since we put her mother in the ground, laid her cheek against that warm horse's shoulder and closed her eyes. She didn't speak, but she stayed an hour, and when she finally came up to the house she had horsehair on her cheek and her face was different, looser somehow, like a fist that started to open. I went down to the corral that evening to thank Tamsin, and I made a mess of it. I'm not a man with words. I stood at the rail and worked my hat in my hands and finally got out, "What you did, with my girl, with the filly." Tamsin was rubbing the roan down. She didn't stop. "I told you I wouldn't mother them," she said. "You didn't." "No," she looked at me then, those pale eyes steady in that weathered face. "I just left a door open. They walk through their own selves or they don't. That's the only way it ever takes." She went back to the horse. "Folks been trying to drag that little girl through a door for a year. Can't be done. You can only quit blocking it." I stood there a while. Down the valley the Sabre Hills were going purple in the last light, the way they did, the way Adeline had loved. "My wife," I started, and then didn't know how to go on. "I know who's missing," Tamsin said, not unkind. "Whole place is shaped like her." And she said nothing more, and somehow that was the gentlest thing anyone had said to me since the burial, that she could see the shape of my grief without poking her fingers in it. I went up to the house with my throat full, and I didn't understand yet that I was already in trouble. That a man can be so busy guarding one door, he doesn't notice another's swung wide. The summer came on hot and green. The grass on the high benches grew belly-deep to a horse, and the quirt ran clear and cold down from the snowfields, and the work that had felt like a stone on my chest for a year started, by inches, to feel like work again. Like something a living man does. The children bloomed in the slow, careful sun of that woman's not mothering. Jesse was down at the corral every dawn. Tamsin taught him the rope, the seat, the long patience, taught him without ever once making it soft, which was the only kind of teaching my proud boy could have stood. She'd tell him flat when he was wrong and flat when he was right, and she'd let him fail and she'd let him fix it, and my son walked taller every week. The anger banked down in him like a fire damped for the day. It wasn't gone. The mad would come up in him sudden sometimes over nothing, and he'd throw down a rope and storm off, and Tamsin would let him go, and the next morning he'd be back, and she'd say, "Mornin'," like nothing, and they'd start in again. She never once chased him. I think that's what healed him in the end. Knowing she'd be there whether he stormed off or not. Knowing one person in the world wasn't going anywhere. And Nettie, my Nettie, haunted that corral now like it was church. She fed the gentle filly. She carried the brushes. She'd stand at Tamsin's elbow by the hour, silent still but present, so present, watching those scarred, competent hands and learning by her eyes. Tamsin talked to her the whole time, not at her. To her, easy and low, the same way she talked to the horses, never waiting on an answer, never letting the silence turn into a held breath. "Hand me that hoof pick, would you?" she'd say, and Nettie would, and Tamsin would say, "Good." And that was all, and it was everything. Because nobody was watching my girl's mouth and wishing. I'll tell you the thing I'm least proud of. Somewhere in that green summer, I stopped going down to the corral to check on my children and started going down to look at Tamsin Hale. I didn't let myself know it for the longest while. I told myself I was a careful father, but I'd find reasons. A fence to mention, a question about the roan. And I'd lean on the rail and watch that lean, weathered woman move through her work, that low, sure voice, the way she'd tip her hat back and squint at the hills, and something in me that had been frozen solid for a year would crack and shift like river ice in a thaw. And the second I felt it move, I'd go cold all over with guilt, and I'd turn on my heel and go back up the hill to the house and the photograph of Adeline on the mantel, and I'd stand in front of it like a man caught stealing. I'd made a promise. That was how I had it figured. I'd held my wife's dying hand, and the promise had been a wall I built around what was left of us, and any warmth that wasn't grief felt like a stone pulled out of that wall. To want a thing again, to feel my heart turn over at the sound of a woman's spurs on the hardpan, that was a breach of faith with the dead. That was the cold getting in. I had it exactly backward, and it took me the rest of that summer and a near tragedy to learn it. One Sunday I rode up alone to the little fenced plot on the rise where Adeline lay, the way I did every week, to pull the weeds and say my piece. The wild roses she'd planted at the corner were in full bloom, fierce and pink and stubborn the way she'd been. I knelt and I cleaned the stone, and I told her about the children, that Jessie was riding fine, that Nettie had touched a horse, and then I ran out of words, because the next true thing I had to say I didn't want to say out loud over my wife's grave. The next true thing was a woman's name. I knelt there a long time with the bees in the roses and the wind off the saber, and I couldn't say it, and the not saying it was its own kind of breaking my word. I'd promised to keep my children warm, and I was so cold inside that I was choosing the cold on purpose, calling it loyalty. I was so busy being faithful to a dead woman's memory that I was failing the living promise she'd actually made me swear. I didn't see it yet. I rode back down with the name still stuck in my chest like a thorn. Tamsin was at the line shack mending a hackamore in the last light. I don't know what put me off my horse and onto the step beside her. Loneliness, maybe. The grave still cold in me. "You ever marry?" I asked her, blunt, rude even. She didn't seem to mind. "Once," she said, working the rawhide. "Long time gone." She tied off a knot. "Had a little boy." The way she said had stopped my breath. "Fever," she said before I could be fool enough to ask. "Took 'em both inside a week. The winter of the deep snow down on the sweetbrush. I couldn't get to a doctor, and there wasn't one to get to." She held the hackamore up to the light, checked her work, lowered it. Her voice never broke. It was just flat and far away, the voice of a wound so old it had gone to scar. "I had a boy'd be about your Jesse's age now. He liked horses." A small breath. "That's why I drift. Wasn't a thing to stay for after. And there's always a horse somewhere needs a hand, keeps a body moving." I sat there on the step with the dark coming down, and I felt about 2 inches tall. All summer I'd been guarding my grief like it was something special, something only I'd been handed. And here beside me was a woman who'd lost a husband and a son both in one snowbound week, and had no grave to ride up to of a Sunday, who'd carried that for years across 1,000 miles of trail roads, and who'd spent this whole green summer pouring her scarred, patient hands into another man's broken children and asking nothing, not one thing, back. "You've been a kindness to mine," I said. "It came out rough, more than you said you'd be." She was quiet a while, then, "They've been one to me too, Merrick." She looked off at the hills going dark. "A body forgets. The sound of a boy laughing at a horse, a little girl trusting your hands." She stood, stiff from the long day, and gathered her mending. "It's a fine thing to be let near it again. I'll thank you not to make more of it than that." But there was more, and we both knew there was more, and it stood there between us on that worn step in the dark like a third person neither of us would name. I rode up the hill that night and stood in front of Adeline's photograph for the longest time. And I'll swear to my dying day I felt her there, not haunting, not sad. Almost laughing, almost shaking her head at me, the way she used to when I'd be too stubborn to see the plain thing in front of my face. "The cold," she'd said, "don't let the cold get in." I'd thought the warmth was the betrayal. I lay awake half that night turning it over, this terrible upside-down notion that maybe I had it wrong, maybe she'd want, and I couldn't finish the thought, it scared me so. I was a coward about it. I'll own that. It took the river to finish the thought for me. The storm came up the way the bad ones do in that high country, out of a clear morning, fast, with no decency about it. It was late August. The men were up on the north bench moving cattle off the dry grass, and I'd ridden with them, and Jesse had come along proud as a lord on the gentled roan, his first real day as a hand. Tamsin had stayed down at the home place with the green string, and Nettie, my Nettie was meant to be helping at the house with old Mrs. Prout who cooked for us. But Nettie had taken to following the gentle sorrel filly everywhere, and that morning the filly had got loose out of the near paddock, and my silent girl, 6 years old and afraid of nothing any more that walked on 4 legs, had gone after it. Alone, down toward the quirt. The quirt that had been clear and low all summer. The quirt that, by noon, with a wall of black weather dumping a cloudburst up in the sabres, was coming down its narrow canyon in a brown, roaring flood 10 feet over its banks, carrying whole cottonwoods like kindling. We saw the storm from the bench and turned the cattle and ran the horses home through rain that came sideways and stung like buckshot. And I knew before I hit the yard, the way a man knows. Mrs. Prout was in the doorway white as flour, screaming into the wind that Nettie was gone after the filly, gone toward the creek an hour back. I have lived a long life since that day, and I have never been as afraid. I went to spin my horse back around and Tamsin was already mounted. She'd thrown a saddle on the roan, the killer roan, the steadiest, deepest-hearted horse on the place now after a summer of her hands, and she had a coil of rope, and she was already moving. And she shouted one thing back at me through the rain, flat and hard and absolutely without fear. "You'll panic and ride past her. I won't. Keep the boy back and follow my line." And she was gone into the gray. God forgive me, she was right. I'd have killed my horse and myself and never found my girl, blind with terror the way I was. But Tamsin Hale rode into that storm like she'd been waiting all her life for a thing finally worth running toward, and she read that flooding canyon the way she read everything, slow, certain, missing nothing. And where I'd have charged the bank screaming Nettie's name into the roar, she pulled up and sat the horse and looked for the filly, because the filly would be where the girl was. She found the sorrel first, just like she figured, shivering on a gravel spit the flood had near surrounded, cut off by a brown channel running fast and rising. And there, soaked through and clinging to a half-drowned willow on that shrinking island of gravel with the water clawing at her boots, was my daughter. I came up behind in time to see it. I will see it till I die. Tamsin put the roan into that flood. That ugly devil horse that had broken 2 men's bones walked into a current that would have rolled a lesser animal because a gray-eyed woman asked him to, low and steady, and he swam the channel with Tamsin standing in her stirrups, and she came up alongside that gravel spit, and she did not lunge or grab or frighten. She leaned down and she said something to my girl I couldn't hear over the water, easy, low, the hoarse voice. The same voice that had left a filly in the willows back in June, and Nettie let go of the willow and reached up both arms, and Tamsin Hale took my daughter up out of the flood and onto the saddle in front of her, and turned that good brave horse for home. The filly followed them across, even the filly trusted her. I got my arms around the both of them on the home bank, all 3 of us soaked and shaking, and Jesse came pounding up off the hill where I'd made him wait, white-faced, and we stood in the pouring rain in a knot, the 4 of us, holding on, and I was saying things. I don't know what. Thank you and Nettie and God and Tamsin all run together. And then my daughter, my Nettie, who had not made a sound in 11 months, who I had near given up ever hearing again, lifted her dripping face from where it was buried in Tamsin Hale's wet canvas coat. And in a small, cracked, rusty voice, a voice like a door opening that's been shut so long the hinge has near grown over, she said one word. She didn't say it to me. She had her 2 hands fisted in that woman's coat. She said it to Tamsin. Stay. I'd swear the rain stopped. I know it didn't, but the whole world went still around that one small word, and Tamsin Hale, that hard, unsentimental woman who'd lost a son Nettie's age and crossed 1,000 miles of trail to keep from feeling it. Tamsin Hale put her weathered face down into my daughter's wet hair and her shoulders shook, once, twice. And I understood that she was crying, finally, after how many years, and that my silent girl had cracked her open the same as she'd cracked open my girl. Stay, Nettie said again, fierce, her little fists tight. Stay, stay. And over my daughter's head Tamsin looked at me, and I looked back, and there wasn't any pretending left in either of us, washed clean as we were by that flood and that one word, and I said the truest thing I'd said in a year, said it right there in the rain in front of God and my children and the memory of my wife. Stay, I said, please stay. She stayed. It wasn't sudden after that, and it wasn't tidy, the way these things never are. She moved nothing out of the lined shack for a long while. She was a woman who'd run free too many years to be roped quick, and I'd buried a wife and had my own slow ground to cover. We were careful with each other, the way two people are who both know exactly what grief weighs. There were long evenings on the porch saying not much. There was the autumn coming on gold over the sabre benches. But the children settled it before we did, the way I think they always do if you let them. Nettie talked now. Not a flood, my girl would never be a chatterer, that wasn't her, but words, real words, more every week and most of them down at the corral, and a good half of them to Tamsin. She'd lost the habit of speech in grief, and she'd found it again in trust, and it was that gray-eyed horsewoman's trust she'd found it in. And Jesse asked me one night in the barn, blunt as his mother's people always were, is she gonna marry you or not? And when I hemmed, my boy looked at me with 11-year-old contempt for grown fools and said, well, you better ask her then. Nettie already decided, like I was slow, like the family had voted and was only waiting on me to catch up. I rode up to Adeline's grave one last time before I asked her. The roses were past, gone to hips, red and ready for winter. I knelt and I cleaned the stone, and this time the name didn't stick in my chest. This time I said it. Her name's Tamsin, I told my wife. She lost a boy, she's hard and she's plain-spoken, and she left a door open for our children when I'd let everything go to ice. Nettie talks because of her, Addie. Jessie stands up straight. I had to stop a minute. The wind came down off the hills. You told me to keep them warm, don't let the cold in. And I had it backward all summer. I thought loving her was the cold getting in. It's the other way. The cold was me, guarding you so hard I quit living. She's the warm. The children knew it before I did. I knelt there in the gold light a long while, and I tell you, the way I felt was not a ghost's permission. It was simpler and better than that. It was the plain, settled peace of a man who's finally read his own promise right side up. Keep faith with the dead by keeping faith with the living. Adeline never wanted a frozen man tending a grave. She'd wanted her children warm. And here was the warm, riding my string and gentling my horses and teaching my son the rope and putting words back in my daughter's mouth. I rode down and I asked her at the corral rail in the last light, hat in my hands, doing it badly the way I do everything with words. And Tamsin Hale leaned on the rail and looked at me a long, quiet while with those pale, steady eyes. You sure, she said. I drift, Merrick. I've been drifting 12 years. I don't know that I recollect how to stay. Nettie'll teach you, I said. She just learned it herself. And something broke in that hard, weathered face, soft and slow, like the first inch a fighting horse gives when it finally decides you're not its enemy. She didn't say yes with a word. She put her scarred, competent hand out across the rail and laid it over mine, and she left it there, and that was the yes. And it was worth more than 1,000 spoken ones, because she was a woman who never said a thing she didn't mean. We married in the fall, in the little white church in Sumner, with the Sabre Hills gone red and gold behind us. Jessie stood up beside me, taller every day. Nettie carried the wild rose hips from her mother's grave because she asked to, in her small, clear, hard-won voice, and nobody who knew the story had a dry eye in that church. Mrs. Prout cried into her hymnal. The old man down in Sumner who'd sent Tamsin up my road grinned like he'd done it on purpose, and maybe he had. That was a long time ago now. I'm an old man telling it from the same porch, and the Sabre Hills go purple of an evening just the same. Tamsin's hair went gray and then white, and she gentled horses on this place for 30 years, and she never drifted again. Jesse runs the Wishbone now, runs it well, and his own boys ride the roans Grandjet. And Nettie, my silent girl, my Nettie, grew up to be a schoolteacher down in Sumner. Of all the things in the world, a woman whose whole work is words, paid to coax them out of frightened children the gentle, patient way they were once coaxed out of her. She says she does it the way her mother taught her, and she means Tamsin, and I never once heard Tamsin or me correct her, because by then it was just true. I made a promise once, holding a dying hand, that I'd keep my children's hearts open and not let the cold get in. I thought for the longest while I'd broken it. I hadn't in the end. I just couldn't keep it alone, and I was too froze up to know it, and the keeping of it rode up my road on a spring afternoon with 8 head of horses and no pity to spare, and gentled the whole ruined lot of us back to life, one slow, honest inch at a time. The cold never did get in, she wouldn't let it. And my little girl, who hadn't said a word since we buried her mother, said the first one to her. "Stay," she said. And she did.